Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to the Assembly Budget Subcommittee number 2 on Education Finance. We have a relatively long agenda today, so we're going to begin. We're going to start, even though we're going to start with item 6110, Department of Education, we're going to go to the LAO's overview of the Governor's May revision, Prop 98 first, so other members can come in before we go back to the first agenda. So if we could have the overview, the presentation first. We'll begin with LAO's office.
Edgar Cabral with the Legislative Analyst Office. And I'm here to give you a brief overview of the Governor's May revision proposals and then provide you with some recommendations and options that we have for you. There's a handout that's being passed out, and I think you guys have a copy of it. So I'd like to start on page 1, just giving you an overview of the Governor's Prop 98 funding levels and comparing those to January to give you a sense of how things have changed since then. So in the 2009-10 year, in terms of overall Proposition 98 spending, there's a small increase, about $50 million. It's due to some technical adjustments. There is a big shift in spending. The May revision proposes to spend $1.2 billion more in general fund, and that's because of a decline in local property tax revenues. And that's really, there's a policy change behind there. That's the governor is moving some property tax revenues, about $877 million, that in January were proposed to go to K-12 education. These are property taxes that we've borrowed from local governments, and instead of going to education, they'll be going to other areas of the budget. So that's required an increase in general fund spending. In 2010-11, there's a $1.5 billion difference. There's a $1.5 billion reduction to Prop 98. This is achieved by eliminating child care services from Prop 98, everything excluding the state preschool programs. And then there's a $300 million reduction, which doesn't have a programmatic effect, but it reduces ongoing money for the EIA program and provides one-time funds as a result, or instead. Just quickly, in terms of the governor's, or in terms of the federal maintenance of effort requirements, the state would continue to meet the requirement in the 2009-10 year, but would fail to do so in 10-11, and the state would need to get a waiver for that. And it appears from our last time we looked at the numbers that the state would still qualify for a waiver. On the next page, on page 2, just wanted to try to walk through a little bit of some of the technical pieces of the governor's Prop 98 proposal. The governor continues the same policies that he had in the January budget, which is assuming that there is no long-term maintenance factor obligation owed to Prop 98. That helps reduce the Prop 98 minimum guarantee both in 9-10 and 10-11. Instead of saying that this is required by Prop 98, the governor is instead proposing that beginning in 2011-12, he would make additional $11.2 billion in additional payments, we call in lieu payments, which are sort of intended to be similar to the maintenance factor, but it pushes it off for a couple years. And this allows the governor to propose, under his current spending levels, to be funding at or above the minimum guarantee. In 2009-10, he's actually $500 million above his estimate of the minimum guarantee, and that amount would go to pay off some of that 11.2 obligation that he's proposing to pay off in future years. In 2010-11, the reduction of $1.5 billion in the May revision is completely due to the governor's what we call rebenching of Prop 98 to account for the elimination of child care. So what the governor has done is said, the Prop 98 is typically a certain percentage of general fund revenues that go towards Prop 98. Well, now that we're eliminating the child care program in its entirety, we don't have to provide that same percentage anymore to Prop 98. We can provide less because we've eliminated one sort of big service that was being provided out of Prop 98. As a result of doing that, by recalculating that, you get savings, you get a lower Prop 98 guarantee, and it allows you to cut an additional $1.5 billion. Absent that change or that rebenching, there would be no additional savings that the governor could get in 10-11 in the May revision proposal if he wanted to fund at the minimum guarantee. On page 3, we talk briefly about our assessment of the governor's plan. As I said before, the governor makes a variety of assumptions about whether we owe or don't owe maintenance factor obligations, and says that those are not owed under Prop 98. The July budget that was passed in July '09 did have some language that acknowledged an $11.2 billion obligation that would need to be paid in future years to restore funding to schools. If you were to make that assumption in building your 9, 10, and 10, 11 budgets, we think you would owe $1.3 billion in additional funding in 9, 10, and an additional $4.1 billion in 2010-11. These are compared to the governor's level. So you would need to provide significantly more than what the governor is providing right now to meet what we call the current law obligation. We think, given the current situation, we don't think it's very likely that you could actually afford to make those payments both in 9, 10, and 10, 11. We had said before in our prior assessments of the governor's proposal that we thought that the plan was tenuous because of these assumptions about maintenance factor. There's an additional risk now, legal risk associated with it because of this rebenching of the child care as a result of the child care elimination. We're not sure at this point whether we think it's really something that's legal or not. And again, if you don't do that child care rebenching, you don't get to score any additional savings like the governor's proposal does in the May revision. So given these kind of uncertainty that's going on, we think the key question really is how much the state can afford to provide K-14 education given the other budget pressures that exist. And as I mentioned, we think it's not likely the state could afford to provide the current law funding levels that we've estimated at this point, both providing $1.3 billion more in 9-10 and $4.1 billion in 10-11. On the next page, on page 4, we have a couple options for you to consider. What we've done here is this shows you 2010-11 spending for Prop 98. I want to tell you a little bit about the assumptions we made before you get to the 10-11. We don't think that you can afford the current law guarantee in 2009-10. So what we think for these options, the way to make it more affordable is to suspend Prop 98 in 2009-10. Now that wouldn't require additional cuts to. It wouldn't require additional cuts to any Prop 98 programs. You could fund it at exactly the same as the governor, but you're essentially, by doing that, you're saying, look, we understand that the governor's level is not sort of doesn't take into account the fact that we owe maintenance factor. We know in reality we owe $1.3 billion more, but we know we can't pay that, so we're going to suspend and just fund at what we're funding right now, and so you've then suspended and allowed yourself to spend at what you're spending at a legal, and legally follow. Protect yourself in terms of Prop 98, and then that also reduces your base for calculating the 10-11 guarantee and makes it likely that would be more affordable. By doing that, you're also acknowledging that the state owes a maintenance factor obligation to schools and that it would be paid off in the long run. So that's a lot of the assumptions that we did before we get to these options that we're providing for you. And we really have two options, and they're the darker bars that are there on that page. The first is 2009-10 suspension only, and then the other one, which we call flat funding. So in that first one, the 2009-10 suspension, what we're saying is suspend Prop 98 in 9-10 to the existing level, and then try to fund the minimum guarantee in 2010-11. And our estimate of the guarantee is 50.8, as it shows on that chart. This is significantly higher than what the governor would provide, and so you would be able to restore all the reductions to child care, and you'd still have about $700 million in additional funds to provide to mitigate some of the reductions proposed by the governor for K-12 revenue limits or any other things that you'd like to restore. Obviously, given that it's that much higher that you have money to restore you can restore child care and restore some of the cuts. It may be even too difficult, and you might not be able to afford that given the other what's going on the other side of the budget as well. So we have another option for you, which is the flat funding approach, which is we just said you're providing $49.9 billion in 9-10 to Prop 98, provide that same amount in 10-11. That would require, though, suspending Proposition 98 and ignoring the minimum requirements for that year. So these are just two options that we thought would give you, that we think are two reasonable ways you can do this. It really depends on how much you think you can afford and provide to Prop 98 versus and how much you need to restore from the reductions that the governor proposed in other areas of the budget. under the flat funding approach, you could restore the child care program, but you would need to make a couple $100 million more in reductions to Prop 98 to make sure that it all balanced out. Going on to the next page, just want to briefly talk. I've talked about this a little bit, just in terms of suspending. Why we think it's potentially a good an approach that can sort of settle some of these disagreements that exist. By suspending, you're recognizing that there is a maintenance factor owed, and schools in the long run will be paid back that maintenance factor. Eventually, funding will be restored, and so it sends a signal that that's the legislature, the state's interpretation of Prop 98, that this maintenance factor does exist. By suspending, though, you also kind of relieve yourself of making those payments in 9, 10, and 10, 11, so you can fund what you can afford. And so we think it potentially could be a good. You could do both, acknowledge the maintenance factor and fund at a more reasonable amount that you could afford. On the next page, so now moving on, and we've been talking about overall Prop 98 funding levels, but now I wanted to get into, if you are going to make reductions to Prop 98, what strategy you should take. And so we have a lot of tables back here that have a lot of proposals in, so I won't go into each of them very detailed, but just to give you a sense of our overall strategy that we're recommending for you. First, we think you should make targeted reductions first. The governor starts by making reductions to revenue limits. We think you should look for other places, other specific cuts to certain programs that we think are less of a priority, or that we think there's a good basis, either because they're over budget or others, for why you should make a reduction. Then after you make all those reductions, then if you need to make more, then you can go ahead and cut from the revenue limits or from the flexibility item. After that, no matter what reductions you make, we also think that you could provide more flexibility. Even if districts aren't hurt too bad from the state side of the budget, they are going to be losing a lot of federal funding from ARA, and we think additional flexibility would help districts deal with that. Next, we think there are some non-Proposition 98 savings that we think you could achieve from K-12. And then finally, there are a few areas where we think you could act now to save money later, not in 10-11, but moving into 11-12. And these are things that require early action, and so you'd have to really start thinking about these things right now. Just to briefly go through all these, on page 7, we have the targeted reductions we think that should go ahead and make. And so we can take questions now or later just to on any of these, if you have any questions on a rationale for them. These are all things we think you should do first before you even consider making revenue limit reductions. Then on page 8, on the next page, we provide a cheat sheet, essentially, for if you did need to make reductions to revenue limits, categorical, the flex item, or to community college apportionments, how much savings you would get from a 1% cut to any of these. And this is just sort of guidance as you're working through developing a budget to give you a sense of what that savings is. On page 9, we have our flexibility recommendations, and we've talked about virtually all of these at some point throughout the subcommittee process in the spring. There's some places where we think you could add programs to the flex item, some consolidations that we think could happen that would be beneficial, and then some restrictions that we think you could either get rid of or just ease, make it a little bit more flexible for schools. And then finally on the last page, or sorry, not the last page, second to last page is non-Proposition 98 reduction options, some savings that we think you can get non-98 related to child care and K-12 education. These are all tied to some of the recommendations we've made before as well. And then the last page is actions that you should take now to save money in future years, and that includes our proposal to move the kindergarten start date. Our recommendation for us that you repeal Prop 49, that would require you to go back to the voters and ask for the ability to go in and make reductions to that program. Because the after-school program was adopted through Prop 49, the state cannot make reductions to that program. So while we're making reductions to programs that provide services for students during school, we don't make any reductions to these that provide services after school. And then there's another recommendation related to adults in correctional facilities.
Department of Finance.
Thank you, Nicholas Schweitzer, Department of Finance. Just want to highlight a few of the administration's May revised proposals for Proposition 98. We have largely, with the exception of elimination of child care, we largely maintain education funding at the level proposed in January. In 8-9, funding is actually up a little bit. We're actually no longer proposing to change that level certified in statute, so we're going to leave it at Proposition 98 at that level. In 9-10, again, we maintain roughly the level of proposed in January, even though the guarantee has dropped significantly. We're maintaining that level by allocating $502 million towards the $11.2 billion in payments that which you know, as you know, we don't believe are maintenance factor, but we believe are owed to schools. And then in 10-11, again, we reduced the guarantee by the $1.4 billion for child care, but for the rest of K-12, we largely maintain the January level through using roughly $390 million in one-time funds to fund ongoing programs. Couple of other significant changes, you know, in addition to the elimination of child care. In January, we had proposals to reduce school district and county office of education revenue limits, and those were tied to reductions, or tied to targeted rather to district administrative costs, and a contracting out proposal for county offices. It was targeted towards a consolidation proposal. We are no longer proposing to target the reductions in that way. We're allowing school districts and county offices to allocate the reductions as they see fit. We've also adjusted the reduction to county offices. Was originally proposed at $45 million. It's roughly $17 million less now to align it with the $1.5 billion reduction that we're proposing to school districts. However, we're continuing to propose the contracting out, although that's no longer tied to a reduction proposal. Aside from that, as I said, we largely, with the exception of childcare, largely maintain January funding levels and largely maintain the interpretations of Proposition 98 that we made in January.
Thank you both so much. Members, there's no vote on this presentation, but if you have comments, any comments on this? Mr. Berryhill.
Madam Chair, on your on the LAO's recommendations for things that we could target on reductions, I'm not seeing anything on. You mentioned kindergarten. Where is that at in this list?
Yeah, that's not on the list on page 7. That's actually on the list on the last page, on page 11. We don't think that our recommendation is not to do it immediately. It would be to do it beginning in the 2011-12 school year, just because we thought you'd need to provide sufficient notification time for parents, and so you don't get immediate savings in the budget year. It wouldn't be until 2011-12.
Yeah, so it wouldn't really. How about textbooks? Any recommendations there where we could?
No, currently the categorical program that we provide funding to districts for textbooks, that's under the flexibility item, and so there are no restrictions for districts on how they can spend that money. So we don't have any particular recommendations on those. And there are also some of the requirements that they purchase additional textbooks. Some of the adoptions have been suspended, so we didn't have any recommendations on that.
How about testing. We seem like we test constantly, and I'm not sure there's not, as much as I like the accountability, we're broke. And so you got to take a look at all these things.
Yeah, we have one recommendation, which would be reduce the number of times that the KC is administered every year. So right now it's done 7 times, and we would recommend moving it down to 4, just because we thought 7 was.
But that's the only test that you're talking about making any changes.
Right, and that would give you $7 million in savings. So it's not a big chunk, but it is one piece.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Brownlee.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I understand the rationale when you say if you suspend Prop 98, that could resolve the maintenance factor issue and signals the state recognizes that a maintenance factor exists. I don't get that.
Well, I think, so right now the governor's proposal essentially funds at the existing levels at about 49.9 and doesn't suspend. And that's because the governor thinks that under his interpretation of how Prop 98 works, that we're funding at the minimum guarantee. And that's based on the assumption that there is no maintenance factor owed. If you assume that we did owe maintenance factor, your obligation would be about $1.3 billion higher than what the governor owes. The governor is proposing to provide to Prop 98 in the 9-10 year. So essentially, you would only, if you believe what the governor believed, you wouldn't need to suspend because you're fully funding Prop 98. You're funding the minimum guarantee. If you believed that the current law approach was the right way to do it, that you did owe a maintenance factor, then you would need to provide a $1.3 billion more. Obviously, given the current situation, we don't think you could provide $1.3 billion more. So the other alternative we think is to suspend, which you would only be suspending if you were implicitly disagreeing with the governor's approach. You're saying we really think that our guarantee should be calculated differently than what the governor is doing, and it should be a higher amount. We know we can't afford it, so we're going to suspend. So that's sort of our rationale. That's why we think it helps you in that sense. The legislature would never consider suspending Prop 98 at the existing level if they didn't think they owed maintenance factor.
Okay. But, that sort of just disregards altogether what the agreement was last year relative to the maintenance factor. But what you're saying is that if you do these things, it will give a clear signal that we're respecting the maintenance factor, but it completely ignores what the budget settlement was last year, which was to say that the maintenance factor was going to apply.
Right. So we think if you really wanted to provide what exactly the Prop 98 minimum guarantee you thought was required under the July budget, you would have to provide $1.3 billion more. Right. Now, given that we don't think you could afford to provide that funding, and also, given that the school year is almost over, so even if you did provide the $1.3 billion now, school districts have pretty much budgeted for the existing year. And another approach is to do a suspension, because the suspension also signals that you recognize that the guarantee was up here. We do recognize it was at this higher amount, and we're not going to provide it, but we're suspending because we're letting you know that we really did think it was a higher amount.
So on this chart, the 0910 for the 50.8 billion, that is a suspension of Prop 98 with a partial maintenance factor payment?
It's a suspension of, on that chart, that shows you the 910 funding level. And so what we did in that case is we suspend Prop 98 in 910.
Uh-huh.
And then from there, in 1011, we fund the minimum guarantee. And that minimum guarantee in 1011 at 50.8 also includes a maintenance factor calculation. And I can't remember off the top of my head how much of a maintenance factor payment is built in there, but you would start paying in 1011, paying some maintenance factor.
Okay, and then just one more question. And so I know that the LAO on the May revise has said that disagrees slightly with revenue figures with the Department of Finance, and thinks that maybe it's $1.5 billion that we could potentially score more in revenue. And in terms of this chart, and you're saying that $53 billion is would be the current minimum guarantee. On what figures are those based?
These are based off the governor's revenue estimates. So if you did use our LAO revenue estimates,
it would be higher.
It would be slightly higher. Yeah.
And what would it be?
It would be I can get you that.
I mean, is it roughly a couple of hundred million?
It would be roughly 500 million higher, I believe, because we would be about
half.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And then one question for the Department of Finance is that I know in your budget proposal too, relative to property tax, you score at, I think, a negative 0.4% in terms of property tax that's going to come into the state on the revenue side.
Decline.
A decline,
Yes.
right. Right, a negative.
Yes.
Negative decline, yeah.
Right.
So why do you do that? Because it seems to me that, at least, what I read in the newspapers, that the housing market is stabilizing more. The county assessors have gone back and reassessed homes at a reduced rate. I mean, that's sort of already sort of behind us and it has happened. So I'm just wondering what the rationale behind that was.
Right. I don't actually handle that forecast myself. We could probably get back to you on specifics, but again, our folks do talk to those assessors, and they make a judgment on where assessed values are going. Another thing to bear in mind that there is a sort of a negative COLA that pursuant to Prop 13 that's being applied to assessed valuations, and that's probably also contributing to the decline. But we can get further background to you on that.
Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Brownlee and Mr. Berryhill. To the audience, this is merely an overview, but if there are any public comments on this item, I'll take those right now. Excuse me, she's left, so go ahead. I was going to take the roll, but she just walked out. Go ahead.
Estelle Lemieux with the California Teachers Association and the Ed Coalition as well. We do not support the recommendation that the LAO is recommending in terms of suspension. We don't support the May revision. We don't want to see any cuts. Isn't that terrible? We're doing all don'ts. We want to see revenues because our schools are in crises. They've been decimated, and we want the legislature to hold up to their agreement that some of you voted on last July. And we think that there is a solution to this, and we expect the legislature to do the right thing. So please make education a priority. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Liz Guillen with Public Advocates. We have a similar message. We don't support all these cuts, and we request that all the legislators work together to find an approach that raises revenue. We believe that it can be done, and we encourage you to do that. On the recommendations around increased flexibility and adding more categorical programs to flexibility, we understand the need for flexibility with dwindling resources, but we want the transparency and accountability that was promised in the existing Tier 3 flexibility, which is not there. And it's not there because those funds cannot be tracked because of the way those funds are currently being allocated. As a result, many parents and communities cannot follow the use of these flex dollars. So if you add more funding to that pot, it means that funding that is originally targeted for low-income students, students of color, immigrant students, there's no ability to track that. And while your FCMAT witness testified that he felt that all districts were doing their best to provide more resources to the neediest students, he himself had done no evaluation. So we really do not know that, and we must know that. Even if the answer is no, it's not being done, we have to know that. So we urge you to tighten up existing transparency and accountability, and if you're going to add more to it, make sure that that's tight as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your comments. We're going to go back to item 1 at some point, but right now we're going to go into juvenile court school funding, and I think our panelists are here. LAO's office, Department of Finance, Division of Juvenile Justice, and Department of Education. And if we could do them in that order that I just mentioned, the LAO's office, Department of Finance, Juvenile Justice, and Department of Education.
Good afternoon, Jim Soland, Legislative Analyst's Office. I'm going to provide a brief overview of the educational system and funding for youth offenders. As you likely know, youth offenders are served at both the county level through court schools and at the state level through the Division of Juvenile Justice, or DJJ. By and large, in terms of the students that are being served at the two different levels, court schools largely serve nonviolent offenders or some of the violent offenders who might be awaiting their trial. By comparison, DJJ largely serves some of the more violent offenders who have committed acts like murder or rape or armed robbery. So that's an important factor to bear in mind when you're weighing the two budgets. There are a couple of big historical pieces to bear in mind related to the respective budgets and students that are served. The first is a feral settlement to the feral lawsuit that really had a large impact on the Division of Juvenile Justice and how education is provided there. One of the biggest factors is that it mandated class sizes at particular ratios. For general education classes, it said that the teacher-to-student ratio couldn't exceed 12 students to one teacher, and that if you're working with a specialized population, that ratio drops from 5 to 1. By comparison, in court schools, there is no state-imposed class size beyond what's imposed for regular K-12 schools. There are certainly cases where local probation officials would make a judgment that the class size should be smaller, and that happens, and that can result in a class size that's around, I think on average, 16, anywhere between 15 to 17 to 1, so pretty different per pupil, teacher-to-pupil ratios. The other historical piece to bear in mind is that there was a quote-unquote realignment of some of the students that are attending the two levels, the county and the state level. The idea was that in 2007 there was a recognition that in addition to the higher costs at DJJ, that the system was flawed in some ways. And so the bill, Senate Bill 81, was meant to reduce the state's reliance on the state level system. It's important to bear in mind that the way this happened was not by actually shifting any students directly from, or I should say very few students, from DJJ to court schools. The way that it was achieved was simply by saying to judges that they no longer had the authority to, at their discretion, sentence nonviolent offenders to DJJ. So essentially, rather than shifting some of the more violent offenders, it's just saying we're taking away the judge's discretion to send the nonviolent offenders to the state system. In addition to that policy change, the state provided a pretty large sum of money to address some of the issues that might arise from this realignment. In 2009-10, the Youthful Offender Block Grant reaches about $93 million to help support this transition. And the money is really specifically targeted for supplemental and basic services for the youth inmates, one of the options for spending that money being education. A quick word on the populations. Both the populations of county court schools and Division of Juvenile Justice are declining in spite of the realignment, although DJJ is admittedly dropping at a faster rate than the court schools. This is due to a few factors well beyond the realignment, such as just changes in general demographics and changes in youth arrest rates that we're seeing across the state. And in terms of the kids who would have been potentially going to court schools rather than DJJ. This is really just a fraction of the students to begin with who are offenders, and then this is just a small fraction of that fraction, so it's an important piece to bear in mind. In terms of the funding itself, I don't have a handout, but I'll just refer you to the agenda because there's a few helpful tables there, to say the least. On page 5, at the bottom in the table, you'll see there are per pupil amounts listed for DJJ, and in 9-10 we're up to about $22,000 per kid, although it ranges from about $20,000 to $22,000. It's important to note when you're looking at these historical trends that prior to the Farrell settlement, the dollar amount per student was around $9,700. So really you can see the costs are being driven by this settlement. By contrast, if you look at the court schools and turn to page 8, there's a breakdown of one of the two major sources of funding for court schools. The first of them being revenue limits. For every student that attends, they generate a revenue limit of about $8,500. This has certainly been subject to some reduction. There wasn't a cost of living adjustment provided, and just a basic reduction by virtue of the fact that the revenue limit is in the broader county revenue limit. But you can see that that number, even at $8,500, isn't entirely different from what the funding was for DJJ prior to the Farrell settlement. They're pretty comparable there. And then if the other piece to the court school funding model, which you'll see on page 10, are categorical funds. And this table lays out an estimate that our office put together of what the categorical funding might look like. And we assumed that with categorical funds, and these are just funds that would be going to counties, not district-level categorical programs, and it takes out all programs that would be used just at the county level rather than to support individual students. So really just the county-level programs that would be supporting direct instruction. We're looking at categorical funding of about $3,800 per pupil, plus roughly $2,000 per pupil for special education. This is again assuming that roughly about a third of the students in the division, or I'm sorry, the county court schools would need an individual education plan for a disability of some kind. So comparing these two sums and just a few basic takeaways, you see that DJJ gets about $20,000 per student, $21,000, and court schools are getting somewhere in the neighborhood of $15,000 per pupil in Prop 98 funds. From our perspective, the class size really can explain the discrepancy. If you're thinking about class sizes of 12 to 1, or in some cases 5 to 1, versus 15, 16, 17 to 1, that is enough to explain the difference in the two funding rates. And it's really affirmed by the way the DJJ settlement was structured. The teacher salaries at DJJ are essentially the local county salaries for teachers, just adjusted for the different hours and different student-teacher ratios. So in terms of the actual amount per day per teacher, they're meant to be comparable. So just a couple final notes. The funding seems comparable, and in terms of the realignment, as I've mentioned, the realignment didn't necessarily shift the most violent offenders to the court schools. Yet the state still provided about $100 million to help mitigate some of the transition that you'd be seeing from some of the students who judges no longer have the discretion to send to the state system. So that's a basic summary of how the two funding systems evolved, and I'm happy to take questions.
Well, you'll be able to get your opportunity, I'm sure, later. Okay, let's go to the Department of Finance.
Elisa Nguyen with the Department of Finance. I'll just to make a few general comments. In general, we continue to support the administration's proposals for governor's budget and the May revise. We didn't provide any additional funding for juvenile court schools, and as mentioned in the Prop 98 overview, we did propose an unallocated reduction to County Office of Education revenue limits. Because it is unallocated, counties could choose to protect their county court schools. I would also note that we are willing, as to take a further look at this issue going forward. And finally, that any Prop 98 savings that were identified from DJJ in the current year and the budget year, we did use for other Prop 98 purposes under our proposals.
Okay, juvenile justice.
Andrea Sharper, Department of Finance.
I'm sorry, what's your name?
Andrea Sharper.
Andrea, okay.
And we'd just like to note that DJJ has been reducing their Prop 98 budget. We've been looking at a bunch of areas, a new business model to realign how the staffing standard package works. We've been working with the federal court that was mentioned that to really streamline things and see where we can reduce costs. Now that we've been working under the federal model for a while, we have a little more confidence with how it works, and so we've been doing that, and we have had savings in the past few years in DJJ's Prop 98 budget, and we've been looking at those, finding out why they're there, and we've been aggressive in capturing those savings, and you'll see that reflected in the governor's budget this year.
Okay, Department of Education.
Heather Carlson on behalf of the superintendent. We don't have a specific recommendation on the DJJ savings. They're kind of out of our jurisdiction. We would make some general comments on the LAO's proposal. We think that some of the numbers may seem a little inflated based on the methodologies that's used. It really depends for special education because it's a SELPA, and each SELPA gets to determine how their funding sources are allocated. We think that $2,000 per student being provided specifically to DJJ court special ed students may be a little inflated depending on the methodology that's used in each SELPA. And we think that there are some categorical dollars that may lead the committee to think that to the degree that that ADA goes up, that their pot of funds for categoricals would go up, and that's not always the case with some of these funds. A lot of these funds are kind of fixed at a specific amount, so to the degree that their population goes up does not necessarily mean that their funding would go up. So, and we do have people here if we have any questions for the department.
Okay, well, let's ask members. No questions? Okay, then we're going to go to the public portion of the hearing today. So if you have questions on this issue, if you could come to the mic. Can you all stay at the table so that you can answer any questions?
Good afternoon. Martha Zaragoza-Diaz, representing the Californians Together Coalition. We done a little bit of work last year with regards to the funding. Excuse me?
You have a mic there? Yes.
Yes, I'm sorry. With regards to utilizing Title III for the English learner portion for the county court and division for the county schools, and we were in agreement last year, and so we are supporting the continuation of that into the next budget year. We do have concerns, however, with regards to the proposal to change the funding from a school attendance to a population basis. I agree with the staff recommendation that this really needs to be looked at very carefully because my understanding is that one of the problems is that many of these students do not receive instruction. And that's been a big, big issue. And so if we change it to a population basis, how do we know that these students are indeed receiving a program of instruction, which is one of the biggest problems that's happening there. So
I'm sorry, where did you get the information that they were not receiving instruction?
I've had some conversations with some attorneys that have been looking at the issue for several years, and I've had several discussions with the individuals in the county schools.
Okay.
Okay. And they've been working on this issue for quite a few years. The other issue is with regards to categorical programs, with regards to utilizing other categorical programs such as the EIA. We think this is probably a good thing to do in light of the fact that many of the individuals in county schools are English learners and probably students from, poor students, individuals, people of color. So we think that identifying and looking at other categorical programs may be a good idea, except we would like to also ensure that, the EIA is supposed to supplement and not supplant. And so we need to ensure that these education dollars aren't necessarily going to be supplanted by other agencies that have an obligation to also provide funding for these county schools and these students. In addition, we think that utilizing other categorical programs is also a good thing in light of the fact that they would bring in the county schools into the CPM, the categorical program monitoring process, and we think that's a good thing, especially in light of the fact that on page 10 it talks about, I forget which page it is, on page 10 they raise the issue of how county offices do not track the allocation of categorical revenues and expenditure for programs. That is a big issue for us. If we're going to provide them with more money, and if we're going to provide them with additional categorical dollars, then we need to know what's happening with those dollars.
Okay.
That's it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry I didn't announce that we had a 2-minute limit, but
sorry.
If you have a pressing point, I'm here to listen. Yes,
I think we have a pressing point. My name is Mike Ricketts. I'm with the County Superintendents of Schools.
I'm sorry, could you repeat your name again?
Mike Ricketts.
Mike.
With County Superintendent of Schools. I represent the 58 county superintendents throughout the state. And obviously this is an important issue for us. I would like to ask, we do have 2 of our county superintendents that made a trip here specifically for this issue. Gary Thomas, who's the county superintendent for San Bernardino County, is here, and I know you know him.
Yes.
That's right. And Superintendent Darlene Robles is also here from Los Angeles County. And I'm wondering, since you're done with the panel, if we could actually free up a couple of chairs and just have an opportunity for them to speak to you about this issue as it relates to their county.
Well, I wanted the panel to stay here so that they can help us answer questions. I'll give them more time to speak, however.
Okay, so let me go ahead and introduce them, and I'd like to make a couple of comments. Before I do that, though, I just want to comment on the issue that was raised related to whether we're funded based on student attendance or we're funded based on student population. And DJJ is funded based on student population, first of all. Just to be clear about that, there is a precedent for that. We're funded only on student attendance. And one of the issues that we do face is that attendance is oftentimes not under our control. Students or youth will be pulled out for court appearances when we expect them to be there, yet we still have to staff for that. So what we've proposed is that we get additional funding and just an augmentation, just a portion of our funding, not the ADA-based funding, but just a portion of it to be based on average daily population rather than attendance, just to stabilize that, just to give us some base funding to stabilize it. So I want to clarify that we're not saying we should move away from an ADA-based funding system, because we fully support that. We know students have to be present, they have to be available in order to learn, so we're not saying move away from that at all. So I just wanted to clarify that, and now if we could have our superintendents speak.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Just before you begin, I'm going to take roll. Just 1 second. Secretary, could you call the roll?
Assemblymember Carter.
Here.
Berryhill. Brownlee. Chesbro. Fuller. Swanson.
Present.
Thank you. Yes. Your name, please.
Oh, thank you. Good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to speak. I'm Dr. Darlene Robles, Superintendent of the LA County Office of Education.
Welcome.
And I have a 10-minute speech, but I'm not going to give it. I'm going to...
well, you've come that far, so you can
I will not.
Time.
I'm not going to read to you, but you have several handouts. My full remarks for today's presentation.
Oh, thank you.
But you also have 2 charts that I'm going to refer to. First of all, I want to dispel the myth that county court schools teach children who do not look exactly like the kids in DJJ. In fact, the kids that we teach are kids who used to go to DJJ but don't anymore. They are kids who are charged with 707B. In fact, every student who, before he gets to D or she gets to DJJ, comes through our halls. So we see the murderers, we see the rapists, we see the carjackers, we see the same types of students that DJJ does. In fact, more and more of the students are staying with us because of the 15-year-old student, one I just spoke to a couple of weeks ago, whose mother I spoke to said, I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure I use a due process to keep him here locally before he goes to state prison. So we have students at our Barry J. Nider Hall that have over 275 kids who are adult charged. And they are students who truly are in crisis. But we do everything that we can to make sure we provide the support services to them. And to hear the comment that we don't teach, I find not only offensive, but absolutely untrue. We are WASC accredited. Our kids go through our graduation. They get their GED. They are out past the Casey. Now, do I have issues like every public school, the quality of teaching? I have the same spectrum as any public school across this state, where I have absolutely teachers of the year that have made it to the top state competition, and I have teachers that I'm working through to say maybe they need another profession. I run the gamut just like everybody, but I'm not going to stand here and accept a statement from someone who has not been in my court schools to say that we don't teach our students. That I'm not going to take at all. You also have in your handout here the type of offenses and also a flow chart that talks about the students who come to us with the same offenses that the students that have DJJ. The issue for us is that over the last several years, systematically, the students who would have been through the feral, gone to DJJ, are now with us in our court schools. So when we come here to ask for the appropriation, the over-appropriation of that $6.5 million that we feel has been over-appropriated over the years to come to the students, it's asking you to have the money follow the students, just like you do with probation. In probation, when you sent them back, you gave probation money. But you didn't follow, the Prop 98 did not follow the students. For the same reason that probation needs it, so do we. The quality of education that we have to give our students is very unique. They need smaller class sizes. We need to segregate our kids. We have situations where I read the paper at the LA Times in the morning and there's been a gang shooting of a young man who killed a 3-year-old. When he comes to my halls or to my camps, I have to do a one-on-one. I'm not funded on one-on-one. But we know that for his safety, we can't put him with the other kids. So it really is a unique situation. So, in fact, the Criminal Justice Realignment report in January of 2009 actually recommended the appropriation of those DJJ dollars to follow the students. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague who is going to share his experience in San Bernardino, Dr. Gary Thomas.
May I ask you a question?
Yes, sir.
I guess just as the charter schools, insist on, dollars following students. I mean, it's kind of accepted concept that happens. And in this particular case, there are additional, complications with each student that you have to. So how, in these times, how critical are those dollars, and have you found that it has made a difference when you've been able to provide the kind of special instruction that's necessary to put some of these young people on the right track?
My office right now runs anywhere from $5 to $10 of a deficit every year because we've made a commitment to the Department of Justice and the recent lawsuit that we have. We have made that effort to provide similar instructional programs as the DJJ, but without the incoming revenue. So it's taken out of my county service fund, and now my total deficit is $45 million. Yeah. So we are providing the service, but not receiving the funding.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, just before you leave, I'd like to ask, the LAO's office to comment on this handout, the criminal justice realignment.
I'm not sure what specific element that you want commented on, but I will say I understand maybe a portion of it has been handed around. I'm not as familiar with this new proposal. This is a proposal that's going forward. It's not addressing, to my knowledge, the prior realignment. And in the conversations I've had with my criminal justice section, they're adamant that this is not meant to justify the request that's being made to shift funds.
Dr. Fuller.
I'd like to address Darlene and Mr. Thomas also. So, if I understand this right, has the federal judgment against the DJJ, has it increased your cost because of increased expectations for the students in county schools as a result?
Well, I believe it has, because we have been sued by several organizations since then. So instead of suing the state, they're now suing our county office. But no one has come with us with saying, here's where you're going to have to get that extra money. Because again, we are a revenue limit funding allocation model, which we appreciate, but we don't control it. We don't control the students when they come to school, court dates, lockdowns, segregation issues. We don't control any of that. Where in the DJJ, they control it because it's by enrollment. And so we have to have students in the seat, which we want because we want to educate them. But there isn't any funding model to make up for those other resources that we provide. But I just, if I may add, Jean, this one comment. It was interesting to hear at this again today that according to the LAO that there's an average of $22,000 per student. We have copies of the school accountability report card that is completed by every DJJ site. And we have copies if you'd like to see them, but I'll just give you a summary. One of the site is $20,698 expenditures per pupil. One is $33,688. Another one is $39,987. One is $62,712. Another is $27,888. $33,000. The last one, $33,006. Now, even by an average, that's more than $22,000 per student. So, for the same type of student, we must educate and provide the same service at only $16,000.
And that was going to be my second question was, is the average cost increasing for the average population? And it sounds like it is. And I guess there would be further evidence if we could look at San Diego's excess cost chargeback to their districts, because I think that would also show an increasing discrepancy. And then just sort of as the last piece, are some of the new education mandates making it a higher target for output development with these students? In other words, are you being held to a higher standard for what their exit skills should look like as they leave your jurisdiction?
Through WASP, we are.
Well, we have WASP, but we also want our students to exit with the skills
in order to get
to high school diploma. Mm-hmm. Our goal in camps, when they're in camps, is to have a transition plan with our partners to make sure that their credits are then accepted by their LEA that they return to. Mm-hmm. And we make sure that they take the KC. We also make sure that they have the appropriate graduation requirements, and that's why we've chosen to be WASP accredited, mm-hmm. so they will accept them. But the unfortunate thing, and I'm sure DJJ has the same situation, our kids come to us, many of them, with severe disabilities, emotional disturbed, special education needs. Over 40% of the kids in my county are English language learners. And the third is that they're reading below the fourth grade level, the majority of them. So bring them up.
So may I sort of summarize then that the Farrell case is putting additional pressure on your program. You have increased increasingly difficult students based on the Farrell judgment in your program. You have increased cost due to the mandates, expectations, and type of disability, so to speak, handicapping condition, whatever you're going to call it, coming through. And yet, even though DJJ has reaped the benefit the last couple years of a higher significantly, as I look at the charts, higher student allocation, mm-hmm. you've made do, and now it seems that this is going to be the final blow, particularly for LA Unified, for this program, if we aren't able to make the money follow the student. Am I summarizing your words?
The only comment I would say is LA County, not LAUSD. Mm-hmm. They have other problems.
Okay. I'm sorry, yeah. I know better.
That's okay. It's 71. What the difference is the systematic process of moving the DJJ students down to the counties has caused a problem. When I look at 2007-2008, DJJ had 1,960 students, and they were appropriated $58.3 million, 2007-2008. We go now to 2009-2010. They have now less than 1,300, but we're allocated $49 million.
So I'll be advocating that we move to have the savings follow the student. Thank you.
Before you leave, can I have the Department of Finance comment on those figures?
Certainly. I think the figures that you're hearing are the appropriation amounts, not the actual expenditures. What we've tried to do is work with staff to provide the end of the year actual expenditures, and that's what you'll see reflected in the agenda. Any savings that we have had, we've been reverting back to the Prop 98 pot, so we've been very aggressive to do that. And where you see those large figures comes when Farrell was implemented and we were putting together these large staffing packages. And then once, at the end of the year, we could say, hey, this really wasn't used. Our population declined, maybe lower than what we had projected, because we do biannual population adjustments. Then savings comes out, but those savings aren't reflected in those numbers.
Okay.
And if I may just say,
yes.
we didn't realize till a few years ago, because I've been working on this for about 4 to 5 years, that there was an over-allocation. And I understand the difference between expenditures and the appropriation. So they were over-appropriated, but then the 6 or 7 or 8 million were back into the general Prop 98 funds. Great, except that that money was allocated for the type of student that belongs in the county, and that's where I'm saying, well, not belongs in the county, has been now in the county, and that money should now follow the student.
Okay, thank you so much for your comments. Dr. Thomas.
Thank you. Gary Thomas, County Superintendent in San Bernardino. I'm going to try to make it brief because a lot of good points have been made, but I think at the crux of this issue is when the students have come from DJJ to the county school programs, probation is in charge of what kids are going to be with each other, not the county schools office. So if they say, we want these 5 kids to receive an educational program, county office has to put a teacher in there and teach those 5 kids. When you hear that we need about 17, 18 students to break even, and our student to teacher ratios are going smaller and smaller because of federal restrictions, the probation department has to put these kids, they have to base how they interact with each other on the severity of their crimes and their age. We don't have a lot of control. In a regular ed setting where you have a small group of second graders and a medium-sized group of third graders, you can put them together in a combination. You can't do that in juvenile hall. So that's at the crux of this issue. 2 other things. When you're talking about average daily attendance versus bed count, that's a whole different scenario. Because we could service kids, thousands of kids come through juvenile hall. Some of them stay with us for 30 days, and during that 30 days they may be in court 10% of the time. Some of them may stay with us for 2 years waiting to be adjudicated back to DJJ. And during that time, we're housing them, we're trying to educate them. So to say that these students are not at risk is almost laughable, because 30% of them are receiving special education services. 1/4 of those students are what we would call emotionally disturbed kids that require huge amounts of resources. They come to us at a 4th grade reading level, and that means we need more intensive reading programs for them. 470% turnover is the turnover rate statewide. So the mobility of this population is also a problem. I'm not quite sure I understand the comment that we're not in the compliance system, because we just went through a monitoring of our categorical programs in our juvenile hall program. So I'm not sure where that is, why that's being said. We are definitely a part of it. Those of us that receive Title I funds through federal funds, we go through a monitoring process just like anybody else. And to say that we're not educating kids, I'll invite any of you to come down to our juvenile court school to see what's going on there. Those are WASC accredited programs. These students are treated very well. Our teachers are definitely meet the highly qualified standards, and the materials that we use in a court school are state standard aligned. So I believe these students deserve no less than to receive the funding that was intended for them, so that we can provide appropriate services to them at the county office level. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Thomas. Mr. Swanson?
Yeah, in my county of Alameda, many of these same concerns exist, and one of the things that gets lost in this discussion, particularly when we're talking about dollars following students, is when we're successful, it actually saves money in the long run, because these are the youth that we're trying to put on the right track. And they're in our custody. And this question of trying to put them on the right track, given the emotional problems that exist and the learning opportunity that is there and mandated under the law, that it's such a wonderful opportunity. I don't know how we can hold back on resources to address this question. So I do appreciate your testimony, and it's informative, because many of those questions have been raised by the county superintendents also in my county.
Just to say, also, I'm looking at about an $860,000 deficit now. Definitely, the scales are different, but the percentages, I'm a smaller county office than my colleague here in Laco. That's a huge chunk of my budget.
But when you look at California, our recidivism rate and our prison system, and the contributing factors to that population, and the fact that at what point do we sort of stop this revolving door? Obviously, this is a very important opportunity that's presented here, and we have to make sure that it's well funded. So.
Just before you leave, Ms. Brownlee has a comment.
I just had a quick question. I'm sorry I missed part of the discussion, but when you were saying that the probationary department then comes to the county and says, we want you to educate these 5 children, so you have to hire a teacher. So are there actually young people who are there who come and are told, no, you don't get the probation department doesn't say you should have an education?
Oh, no. There's a difference between what happens up at the state level. DJJ runs the whole thing. They house the students. They provide the educational program. When it comes to the county level,
right,
it's a cooperative partnership, if you will, between probation and the county superintendent's office. Mm-hmm. But probation has the authority to say, we have to separate these children because of their age and offense, and there's only 5 of them, and we need a teacher in there.
Thank you.
That's the difference.
Okay.
Thank you so much for allowing us extra time. We do appreciate it.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you,
Good to see you.
Thomas.
Thank you.
Good to see you. Next.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Members, Dennis Myers with the California Association of School Business Officials, fully in support of what the court schools are requesting. We think it's an issue of fairness for the students that are in those programs.
Thank you.
Terry Burns on behalf of the counties of Sonoma, Santa Clara, San Diego, and El Dorado. I want to associate myself with the remarks made by the other superintendents. I would also, at Dr. Barber's request from El Dorado, continue to press on that point that sometimes we are required to have very, very small classes. We are required to have a teacher there even though that particular student may have a court day that day, and so no teacher is needed. We are required to fulfill all of those things with a 17-student minimum break-even point. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Members, Michael Holsizer on behalf of the Kern County Superintendent of Schools Office. We know you have a long agenda. We'll be short. I just want to acknowledge and thank Assemblywoman Fuller and also Mr. Swanson for acknowledging really the issues that county court schools are dealing with, and we would certainly ask that you follow the recommendation from Assemblywoman Fuller, and that's simply not increase funding in Prop 98, but simply redirect existing savings that you've identified from DJJ funding to county court schools. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for your comments.
Mike Gilburn on behalf of the Humboldt County Office of Education, the Orange County Office of Education. In another life, I was a teacher, a vice principal, and a principal in the juvenile court schools for a 9-year period. And so I have a little bit of familiarity with this. One of the things that I sit here and I listen to is the relative difference between the severity of the crime they've committed and not. And I can tell you that when I was doing this, I had very severe students in my classroom, and I was in the camps and the ranches where they had the least severe. We had murderers, we had rapists, we had all of them. But that doesn't matter in the juvenile court school. What they've done is not our purview, that's the probation's purview. Our concern is are the educational services that these children need. Now, whether they committed a murder or whether they are habitually truant, if they read at the 4th grade level or can't do addition, then that's what we have to teach. So the severity of the crime is really a non-issue. It's what are the educational needs of these children. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Pam Bichela on behalf of the Alameda County Office of Education. Want to thank several members of the committee for their comments and Mr. Swanson for identifying our goal in Alameda County, which is to rehabilitate students. And we need funding to follow students so that we could do that, and want to align ourselves with all of the previous comments made. Thank you.
Thank you.
Estelle Lemieux with the California Teachers Association, also representing the Education Coalition. We wholeheartedly support this issue here. As a former court school educator myself for 17 years, I was one of those educators who spent locked up in a classroom, 15 students for the most part, every day. And believe me, on one given day, 3-4 students show up who read at below the 3rd grade reading level. As a teacher, I had to be prepared to have individualized instruction for each kid, no matter what level they were operating at that time. So it's tough work. It best prepared me for the kind of work I do today. And these kids need, they're not at-risk kids. These are high-risk kids. They've had the heart attacks. They need all the help they can get. So please support this. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Tiffany Mock with the ACLU Committee and Chairwoman. Thank you for this opportunity. I want to first say all I hear from everyone is that needs to be more money, needs to be more support, and we want these kids to learn. We couldn't agree more. That is absolutely essential for California. I just am here today to express concerns about funding that is not tied to the daily attendance of a student. I want to make sure that if the state's going to pay to have a child taught, that the child is taught. As much as I hear concerns about that a child isn't necessarily there because of medical reasons, because they have a court appearance, maybe we should make exemptions, maybe we should explore other strategies to fit that. We just don't feel that the strategy is removing that whole funding source from the daily attendance. We feel that's very important, and that's our position. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sandy Silberstein, representing the Riverside County Office of Education and the 23 districts in Riverside County. These are all of our students, and that's why our school districts are in support of this shift as well. We think the money should follow the kids. Thank you.
Terry Anderson on behalf of the Monterey County Office of Education in support of the funding shift. Thank you.
Jeff Freitas with the California Federation of Teachers in support of the funding shift that we've been talking about.
Thank you.
Adonai Mack with the Association of California School Administrators, and I'd also like to echo all the comments by the previous presenters. We also support the funding shift. Thank you.
Steve Henderson, California School Employees Association. We also support the funding shift.
Susan Stewart with the Contra Costa County Office of Education and School Superintendents. We support the funding shift.
Other comments on this issue? Members? We do have recommendations today. There will be additional recommendations on Thursday, but today the recommendations are as follows to the members. We're going to vote on the following 4 recommendations. Number 1, to approve the Department of Finance April letter request to extend an expenditure authorization for $1.7 million in one-time federal Title III funds, 1 additional year in order to complete the technical assistance to DJJ and court schools. Number 2, hold court schools harmless from further revenue limit reductions in 2010 and 11, when the subcommittee takes final Proposition 98 actions for May revise. Number 3, adopt supplemental report language requiring the LAO to identify options as a part of the 2011-12 budget to, number 1, improve access to existing state and federal categorical funding, including economic impact aid for county court schools, and 2, align court school funding with funding rates for other alternative programs. And number 4, require FCMAT to conduct a fiscal assessment of the LACOE court schools. There will be additional recommendations on Thursday, but those are the recommendations today, and I'd ask for a motion. Question?
I would like to know how I can make a motion to add that we redirect the savings from the DJJ to the county schools.
Let me finish this motion, and then you can make another motion. May I have a motion, please, for this?
So, on the hold harmless piece, does that have anything to do with what Ms. Fuller's talking about?
I think basically it does, doesn't it?
No.
No.
They would not receive the governor's proposed revenue limit reduction. This would be on top if we were to do this.
Okay.
But that will be brought back up.
So I'll move the 4, I think it was 4 points that you
4 points, 4
just
recommendations.
made.
And if I could have a second to those 4?
Okay, I'll second.
Okay, it's been moved in second. Could you please call the roll?
Assemblymember Carter.
Aye.
Berryhill. Brownlee.
Aye.
Chesbro. Fuller. Swanson.
Aye.
Has 4. It's out.
Those recommendations have been approved, but we will be doing additional recommendations after Thursday. Dr. Fuller.
Yeah, I'd like to make a motion that we redirect the savings from the DJJ and that those funds follow the student to the county court schools.
Second.
It's been moved in second that, can you repeat the motion one more time, just so we have it for the record?
That the savings from the DJJ be redirected to follow the students to the county court schools.
Can you call the roll, please?
Sure. Assemblymember Carter.
Aye.
Berryhill. Brownlee.
Aye.
Chesbro. Fuller. Swanson.
Also aye.
4 votes.
Motion carried. Thank you, Dr. Fuller. We will return to item 2. Item it's the April letter and May revised letter. There's no presentation, but we're back to the beginning. And thank you, panelists. And
We have what?
if we have any questions from members before we vote, there's no presentation. Per member request, we'll have 2 votes. The first action. No, I asked for public comment. Thank you, Mr. Swanson. If we have public comments on issue 1, that's the April letter and May revised letter adjustments. Are there any public comments for issue 1? Issue 1 is to approve item 1 regarding California high school exit exam. A motion, please. Number 1. To approve item 1 as one motion. Exactly. Together. A second, please, on item 1. It's been moved in second that we approve item 1 regarding California high school exit exam. Call the roll, please.
Carter.
Aye.
Berryhill. Brownlee. Chesbro. Fuller. Swanson.
Swanson, aye.
Open.
That motion will be left open on the floor. We'll need members to come. Item number 2, to approve items 2 through 14 on the vote-only list as amended. Need a motion, please?
I'll move items 2 through 14.
It's been moved by Assemblymember Brownlee. Second?
Second.
Second by Mr. Swanson. Call the roll.
Carter.
Aye.
Berryhill. Brownlee. Chesbro. Fuller. Swanson.
Swanson, aye.
Has 4 votes.
A motion carried. The roll will be left open for item number 1. Issue 2, Governor's Mandate Suspension Proposal. Our panelists today will be the LAO's Office, Department of Education, and Department of Finance. We'll begin with LAO's office.
We've already provided quite a bit of detail at this point on where we stand at mandates. So on mandates, so just to recap again some of the big highlights. I mean, it's 51 education mandates, each with as many as a dozen sub-requirements that are being imposed on local school districts that they're required to perform regardless of whether or not they get funding. There are costs of about $416 million annually. That's adding to a backlog of $3.6 billion that the state will have to pay off at some point. A lot of the reason that there's the backlog is because of deferrals, which were deemed unconstitutional. In addition to all of this, mandates are pretty severely flawed and oftentimes implementing policies that aren't, in our view, overly worthwhile. So given all of these things, we had our proposal to individually reform the mandates and achieve savings by eliminating all but a handful of them.
Okay, thank you, I think. Okay, Department of Education.
Heather Carlson, Department of Finance. I think we would just recommend that if the committee did decide to accept the governor's proposal to suspend or the LAOs to go through policy committee, we would require that we'd ask for them to go through policy committee so that the public can be vetted and that districts have time to weigh in on some of these proposals.
Okay, Department of Finance.
Thomas Todd, Finance. We too, I mean, we have very little, I think, to add to this item beyond what was discussed at the May 4th hearing. We too would also support, obviously, the idea of any discussion of elimination of these things going through the policy process, and we've indicated that before. One technical matter while we're on the subject of mandates that I'd like to bring to your attention. We had sort of a conforming adjustment in our May letter to actually add one additional mandate that we failed to identify a governor's budget. So, whatever action you take, if it's to defer mandates, we would just ask that at some point you take an action to actually add that one. So that's fine.
Okay. At this time, I'd like to open the floor for public comments on this issue.
Thank you. Dennis Myers with CASBO. Also, on behalf of the Education Coalition, we're not for suspension of mandates. It's nearly impossible for school districts to toggle these on and off. So either get serious and fund them or look at them one by one and repeal them. But the on-off idea just doesn't work in reality, so we'd ask you to reject the governor's proposal. Thank you.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, members, Jeff Frost, representing the California Association of Suburban School Districts. Like the last time we were here about a month ago, we would ask you to adopt the staff recommendation, oppose the governor's proposal, and really shift this issue to the policy committees. I know that Ms. Brownlee has legislation that she's moving forward. I know that Senator Lieu is contemplating some reform issues. I'm not sure whether it's this year or next year. But I think reform is clearly warranted. The question is how you do it. We don't think the budget process is the way to do that.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Terry Burns on behalf of the El Dorado County Office of Education and Saddleback Valley Unified School District. We would concur with Mr. Frost. This is a policy issue. School districts simply cannot walk away from these issues on a one-time basis. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sandy Silverstein, representing Riverside County School Districts, and I don't know if you recall, but at your hearing on mandates, we testified to another option you might consider, and I'd like you to think about it. We absolutely agree that the mandate reform should be done through policy committees, but something the budget committees could consider is giving districts temporary and immediate relief, at least, from the claiming process. We understand we need to continue to meet these mandates, but to require us to continue to file the paperwork and do all of that when we have fewer people at the sites to perform this work is crazy, especially when we know we're not going to be paid for a very, very long time. So in aligning with the flexibility that you gave us last year, we're suggesting a next step in flexibility might be to give a temporary hiatus from the claiming process and allow districts to simply self-certify for a brief period of time, that period of flexibility, their compliance with the mandates, and perhaps have an LAO overview of how districts complied. And then during that time, we can start that mandate reform discussion to see what it would look like coming out the other end. But it would give us temporary relief. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Deborah Brown with the California School Boards Association. We support the staff recommendation to continue the deferrals and then have this move through the policy committee to look at ways we can reform the process. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Peter Birdsall, representing the Sonoma County Superintendent of School. We support the staff recommendation.
Steve Henderson, California School Employees Association. We also support the staff recommendation.
Okay, thank you. I am going to ask for a motion, but we have new members who have come in. If you have comments on this issue before I make a recommendation. Okay, then. I'm going to ask for a motion to reject the governor's proposal to suspend mandates and continue the current deferral approach. I also recommend that the legislature consider individual mandate reform through the policy process, and I'll ask for a motion.
Second.
Moved by Ms. Brownlee, second by Mr. Swanson. Could you call the roll, please?
Assemblymember Carter?
Yes.
Berryhill? Brownlee?
Aye.
Chesbro? Aye. Fuller? Swanson?
Swanson, aye.
Has 4 votes. Passes.
Thank you. Motion carried. Issue number 3, governor's proposal for funding for behavioral intervention plan mandate. Our panelists are Department of Finance, LAO, and Department of Education. In that order, please.
Apologies. Jim Soland, LA. I'll just provide a really quick recap of where we are in behavioral intervention plans, if that's helpful. So as you know, in 1990, the Hughes Bill was passed to address students with disabilities who have behavioral issues. There are a couple major policy issues in the bill, seclusion and restraint, the other being the intervention for the student. In 2004, as part of the federal IDEA reauthorization, the reauthorization essentially looked at California's model for this type of service and adopted many of the same provisions, essentially creating federal requirements for the same activities. So really, from our perspective, it's not even a matter of a policy issue so much as a timing issue in terms of the services provided to students and the costs associated with it. And as we mentioned in the prior hearing, we would just try and find a way absolutely to maintain the restrictions on seclusion and restraint of students, and also to maintain the regulations as they exist, simply acknowledging that since the time of the passage of the state law, there have been changes in federal law that make it a requirement and thereby relieve the state of its mandate obligation.
Okay, thanks. LAO. I'm sorry, Defiance. Go ahead.
Lisa Mrzinski with the Department of Finance. We just want to be on record that we continue to support the settlement agreement that we've reached.
Thank you. Thank you. Department of Education.
Heather Carlson, Department of Education. We would continue. We did read the LAO's initial proposal, which was to eliminate the mandate, get rid of our regulations. We think that our regulations do exceed federal law, but we also believe that they're best practices for kids, their safety. We think that this is what we need in order to ensure that kids are getting the services that they required by the people who are best trained to do so. We are more than welcome to sit down at the table and address the issues of the changes in federal law and look at what the possibilities are. We do have somebody from our department if you have any specific questions regarding the behavioral interventions and what our regulations do.
Members' comments? Then I'll ask for public comments.
Good afternoon. Deborah Brown with the California School Boards Association. And I spoke to this when you heard it earlier, so I'll just reiterate that we do support the terms of the settlement of the agreement and would urge you to enact legislation and funding to do so. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hi. Brandon Tartaglia with Disability Rights California. We do believe that the state laws regarding behavioral intervention plans are the interpretation and implementation of the federal requirements, and if there are any changes or anything to be recommended, we do want to make sure that folks in disability organizations do have ample input into that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Dennis Myers with CASBO, speaking in full support of the settlement and in opposition to anything less than that. Thank you.
Mike Ricketts with the County Superintendents of Schools in support of the settlement as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Any other comments or from members? Then the action is I have two recommendations. And I need a motion. Number one, to reject the governor's proposal to provide $65 million in ongoing Proposition 98 funding for purpose of the BIP settlement. And number two, direct staff to continue to work with the LAO and special education experts to look at the costs and benefits associated with aligning state policy with federal law. If I could have a motion, please. It's moved by Mr. Swanson and second by Ms. Brownlee. Could you call the roll, please?
Carter?
Yes.
Berryhill? Brownlee? Chesbro? Fuller? Swanson?
Swanson, aye.
6-0.
Motion carried. Thank you so much, panelists, for coming in today and sharing information with us. We really appreciate it. Thank you. Yes, I'd like to call the absent members on issue number one to approve item one regarding California high school exit exam.
Chesbro? Fuller? No. 4-2.
Motion carried. Thank you all so much for coming today and participating. Thank you, members. I'm sorry?
Members can add on.
Yes, you can add on. Thank you again.